welcome to YouTube. This is our first official video appearance on the Archispeak YouTube channel.
Yeah, they said that I had a face for radio, and for some reason you want to stick it on a video.
We're just giving people options, more ways to get their Archispeak. This is important. We got to get it out there. And this is totally new announcement. We've got a couple of episodes already up on YouTube, but they're audio only. They're just the podcast on YouTube. This is the first dual purpose show. So look at us like Swiss Army knife with the Archispeak here.
Just like this. Blurry, whatever.
Yeah, well, you got a fancy camera.
Exactly.
Of course, it's going to be blurry. That is the big announcement I think that we'll just kick off the show with, is that we're excited to do more on YouTube as time progresses. We won't mention what those things are yet, but we have some, what we think are incredible ideas. Incredible. I mean, you're going to be blown away.
How could they not be incredible?
Look where they're coming from, people.
Exactly.
Come on. So, those of you who are audio listeners, this episode, it makes no difference which one you're watching or listening to, but there might be future episodes that we'll release where it will be better to be on the visual platform rather than the audio platform. Yeah. We'll still release those in audio form, but there will just be extra layer of information provided in the visual. So we're excited to get going here and start building our audience. So if you could, please head over to YouTube. We'll put a link to this in the show notes. You can get to that right inside your podcast player, or you can go to archispeakpodcast.com and find this episode 293, and you can click the link to go to our YouTube channel, where I want you to subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you know when new episodes are released there, so you can check them out. And that really helps us get the show more exposure, and it's all good for the architectural world out there. So hopefully you can do that for us. It doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't hurt. It's not painful. It doesn't bite. Like all those things are true. And so please do that. It really would help the show out.
And as they say, subscribe early, subscribe often.
If you hit the button twice, make sure you hit it a third time.
Yeah.
That's right. So that's it for that announcement. I think other than that, let's jump into this article that was on Architizer. I don't remember exactly when it was on Architizer, but let's look and see. I don't actually see a date.
There is no date.
It's timeless. It doesn't get much more timeless than this.
Architecture School is broken. Here's how we should fix it. By Ross Brady.
Yes. Ross Brady. So I don't know Ross. Do you know Ross?
I don't. But
okay. So we can talk freely here.
Yeah.
There's so many themes like this, that architecture is broken in various ways. And I think we can totally agree with that. There's nothing wrong with that statement. There's a lot broken about it. There's a lot of stuff that actually works somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like every time I see a building, I'm like, that is incredible that actually happened, because it is so difficult to pull off. So architecture and architecture education are not that different.
It seems like there's been this, I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm starting to pay attention more. I've been in such a hole where I haven't really looked at a lot of social media and been getting back on.
I miss you over there, man.
I know.
I do miss you over there. Yeah.
But I've been slowly but surely getting back on, in both in Twitter and even LinkedIn. They've seen a lot of articles about architecture being broken, architecture school being broken. We had kind of chatted a while back about we're 3 recessions away from profession extinction. And it's interesting. It's like, so everybody's putting it out there that we have systemic problems, and what do we do about it? And it's interesting because and even reading the book Out of Architecture, which hopefully you've completed your homework.
I cannot comment.
They even outline in the book, through narrative stories, the saga of architecture school, the profession, and everything else being broken, and kind of being the factors of why people leave. And, the article actually really does kind of like start to highlight something that we've talked about a lot, is this huge disconnect between school and the profession, where I truly believe that there's a lot of really valuable things that are coming out of school. But in a way, I, now as a practitioner, want more, need more. And I think we, as the profession, should demand more from school, because...
What do you mean by that? By you want more and you need more? You mean in a graduate, or
I remember when I had worked for a little while just as an intern, summer interns and things like that. And then as I started to interview for my post-graduation life, I remember, and it happened to be the firm that I chose to go and work for. He sat me down and, well, first he kind of complimented me that I have a lot more experience than a lot of the people who were, applying for it. But he basically,
That's not because of school.
it wasn't because of school. That was definitely not because of
Right.
school. That was that 4-year hiatus that I took from school where I was working for an architecture firm. They did a lot of OJT, a lot of things,
Extra experience.
extra experience that for me,
Right.
when I went back to school, and we can even talk about this for a little bit, is just how the influence of practice sort of made me a bad student when I went back because
Mm.
I was always criticized about my limitations, about making it buildable and all of these
Practical.
and practical and stuff.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
and so the conversation that I had with this interviewer, which again ended up being my boss and my first mentor, he basically said, when students come out of school, they're useless. He goes, look, I was useless when I came out of school, and he was like
Yeah,
pointing
right.
around. Everybody was useless when they came out of school because
Yeah. Right.
what it teaches you is this critical thinking. It teaches you about design. It teaches you about things. That's not what the profession wants and needs, not from a recent
Yeah.
graduate. They need people to produce, right? And I don't necessarily want the school graduates to come out of school not being able to critically think and not being able to think about expressive designs and things like that. But I do want them to be able to assist in what we're essentially going to be assigning them early on is like, okay, fine. You've been taught how to design, but you haven't really been taught how to put together a building. And we're like, okay, it's our job. However, and then this is the however, it's like, now you're billable and
Mhm.
now I'm having to teach you. And so, in some people's minds, it's just like all of those billable hours are throwaway hours. And some people say, I've heard this countless times through many a different senior person, project manager or something. It's just like, I don't want to take on new people because I have a demanding project, a demanding timeline, and I don't have time to stop and teach them how to do the job that I want them to do. And it's a valid point. And I don't know if you saw another article floating around. I think you may have sent it to me, maybe not, about our disconnect from our building knowledge, the tectonic knowledge that we sort of don't have when we come out. And those are the kinds of things that project managers and project architects are really looking for. New interns, recent graduates, that's what they're really looking for. That's what they really need.
Yeah.
And so that's where the gist of this article is. They're talking about this defense-based design. It's like the first few years, it's all about like, how can you out-design the next person? How can you defend your design? Whatever it is, may not be a building, it may be a building, is better than the other person. They start developing this intuition. And how many times have you sat in a client's boardroom talking to them about the design that you're doing for their, X $1 million budget? And they're just like, well, why are you doing this? It's like, well, because it feels right. You start talking about the intuition. You're just like, that's a hard sell, man.
I mean, it depends on the person delivering that message. I think there are some people who can inspire a client to go to think
True,
outside of
true.
their typical realm. And so it's not like that doesn't happen, because it absolutely does happen. But there are also, you do have to get to very quickly a constructible, practical solution. And I don't mean practical as in dumb. I just mean as like this thing actually has to get built in a certain amount of time. It has to get detailed and everything. It has to get approved. It has to go through all of these real world processes to become a real thing in real space for real people to inhabit. And so, yeah, you can't live in that, imagine if you will, kind of a thing for very long, because you've got to get from that to reality in a short period of time. And by short, I mean a couple of years, which is not really short, but it's way fast for an architectural project.
I was going to say it's short. It's short in the AEC world. A few years is like, if you can get it's just like, oh, I got this project done from design to construction in 3 years. Like, oh, that's amazing. I mean, even residential houses, sometimes construction can be like 18 months or something like that. I remember way back in the day when I was doing residential design, and, we were having very slow process of things because people are like, hey, I want to change something, or hey, I want to do this. So we were talking about the book Out of Architecture, and we were talking about the Cube project. And, they talk about the Cube project in there. Now, we didn't do the Cube project, but we did something very similar to it, which basically, they were basically asking you how to think about something without instructions. And a lot of times we go through that process early on, like say when we're given a project or we're pursuing a project, there's a lot of things that we've got to do a lot of fact finding with. First, we start to think about it in a more practical aspect. And I'm talking about experience. I just, sat through a charrette with a bunch of other people in our office. We were, basically starting the initial process of establishing our qualifications to submit them to a potential client. But we went through the fact finding. So it was like that practical application of like, what the design could be. And then as we started to say, okay, here's all like the practical limitations, here's this, here's that, we started to explore, something a little bit more ethereal, a little bit more kind of intuitive. Let's just call it that,
what if?
But everything was rooted in a practicality. But I think it was going back to that process that we learn in school about first learning how to thinking without instructions. That's what that cube project was. It's just like, okay, so everybody built a cube and, walked around. Some were perfect, some were imperfect. And then it's just like, okay, now I want you to do it again, but I want you to do it take the blinders off and just go completely bananas, do whatever. And then they, start talking about the deconstructed cube, applied cube, and all of these other things. And that's when you start to explore your mind and explore. So it's really starting to teach you how to think without instructions. And we do that often. And so I don't want to downplay the importance of that kind of education, but I also think that we're doing ourselves. And I've said this, countless thousands of times. I don't want to downplay the importance of this marrying up of the practical built, that word we like to shy away from when we're in architecture school. I want to talk about the B word. We want to talk about the A word. We want to talk about capital A architecture and all of that other stuff and what our soul can provide to you.
Well, and that's what we're passionate about.
Exactly.
I mean, and there are people at various levels of that passion, and you could talk about the people who just like to make buildings out of concrete block all the way to capital A architecture. And there's everything in between those two stops. The whole idea of architecture school has to change implies a trade-off. If it takes 5 years to get an undergraduate degree from an accredited university, if you want to be Arch, you want to be an accredited, architectural graduate that you then can take the next step to pursue licensure, there has to be a certain set of steps to get from here to there. And so what we're saying is that needs to, and this article is saying that needs to change. And it's basically, let's just cut to the chase. It says less design. What the trade-off is we can do less design training and more practical business, buildable, construct, there's all kinds of other things you could fill that in with to create a more well-rounded architect upon graduation, even though you can't call yourself an architect yet, right? But that's the idea.
So, and I'm glad you actually said that because, as you were talking, it kind of like popped in my head. I was like, okay, well, think about the pathway that we're now starting to pursue of licensure upon graduation. So if you have a license upon graduation, what kind of practical experience or what kind of practical knowledge are you supposed to have that license? It's a lot more building knowledge than you would normally graduate with, correct?
Yes, it is more for sure. But is it actual useful knowledge, or is it just memorization of diagrams out of books?
Well, I would say that it's a lot more of an understanding of construction and building than we would normally graduate with. Because
it might be,
but is it,
if you can retain it?
Yeah. But is it practical experience that probably not at all. Not. But it's still one of those things that
it's a tough problem. The reason that it's like this is because it's a tough problem and there's not one way to solve it, just like a real design problem, right? Just like everybody in studio got the same prompt and had to come up with their interpretation of the cube. To go back to the conversation before, and they were different. That's exactly what we're talking about here on a much larger scale, which is the education slash licensure slash trajectory of a career of an architect. How useful can you be? How soon? Because this is coming at it from a perspective of the business of architecture.
Yeah.
And it's not like the business of architecture does a whole lot to get people to get from A to Z very quickly either, right? So we're busy in the business of architecture pointing at the education side, saying, how come you're not putting out more useful people for us? And at the same time, you're never allowed to go on a site visit as a young professional in an like I'm, never. It does happen, right? And there are there are some education programs like the one that you went through at Auburn where it's very hands-on, right? And Cal Poly, where I went to, the motto is like learn by doing, right? And it was very hands-on. And there are schools like that. And it's not to say that they don't exist, but there is a lack of getting people into the field in the profession to see what the hell they're drawing before they're drawing it so that they actually understand how things are going together because they're not getting that in school. This is a really interconnected mess. And I think one thing that this keeps coming back to is like, we have to rethink it all. It all has to be rethought. And you can't just change one and the others continue to operate the same way because that won't work either.
Yeah. And that's why it is definitely not a one solution because we spend so little time truly mentoring early on because a lot of times people just don't want to be bought. They need other people. Look, I need you to do this, but I don't have time to tell you how to do this. So what is different from once they get into the profession than school? Because in school, we're like, hey, I want you to design a building. You don't know anything about a building. We're not going to teach you about a building yet, but I want you to design a building. And here we're like, okay, here we're designing a building, but I want you to do details. I want you to do code research. I want you to do this. I want you to do that, but I don't have time to teach you. So you're going to have to teach yourself. Oh, and that program that we need you to do it all in, you
better be damn good at that.
You better be damn good at that. Oh, you didn't take any classes on that? Well, you're going to have to teach yourself because I don't have time to teach you that either. You're absolutely right.
Designed to fail, man. This whole thing.
Yeah.
It's a miracle it works at all. I keep thinking that.
You started off with saying if you go past some buildings and you're just like, wow, it's amazing that got built.
Talking about buildings that I've designed, right? Oh my God, they actually did it.
I go to some of the, and I'm not going to point out any names, but there's some Starchitect buildings that I've visited that are amazing looking buildings. But, then the senior project architect in me who starts to look at a building and starts to see how it's going together and stuff. I'm like, I can see where some potential failures are going to be. I was inside of a building and everybody was enjoying the building. It was an absolutely beautiful, spectacular space. But I saw, you could see through the building. You could see water ponding in areas that are up against joints.
I remember you tell me about that.
Exactly. And I'm not going to say what that building is. I mean, maybe, we'll talk about it in later one of our, amazing upcoming videos.
Maybe we will.
But you're just like, that's going to fail. That is going to fail.
Well, and this article points out this idea of creating containers of space versus buildings for the utilitarian, like the use of the people who actually are going to use it. And there's a clear distinction there. Like one is paper architecture, one is real architecture, and that there is kind of a failure to bridge the gap in school, at least, to get from paper architecture to real architecture that people will actually live and work in. And that is a reality of our profession. But I have to say, it's a trade-off. And what are you willing to get rid of so that you have the space in an architectural education to put these kind of practical training pieces in? And then I also want to just point out that we don't need more boring, crappy buildings. We don't.
Yeah.
The value of an architect is in the kinds of spaces and buildings they can create. And we still have to work within all the constraints of budget and program and code and all those things. But we need more great architecture, not less either.
Right.
And so that's a fear of mine.
So
this kind of
that's totally it. And that's where I feel like this catch-22 is putting us, because if we constantly say that the disconnect is between school and the profession, but it's the school's fault, or then the school is saying, but it's the profession's fault. We're just going to get those kind of like banal, boring, yawner buildings and stuff. And so I think if there's a lot more cohesiveness, a lot more, I've never understood why there isn't more interaction with the profession in school. So we had visited just because my 9th grader is interested in going into law. So I decided, it was like, you know what? Hey, let's take you over to the University of Michigan School of Law. Absolutely beautiful buildings, beautiful law quad. And I just kind of like wanted to walk around with her and just have her kind of like feel what it is to be in a college campus and stuff. And you could see all of these students buzzing around, and you could see the serious, stern look on their faces like, oh my God. But we actually even like walked into one of the common spaces, and you could tell that there was like real lawyers in there talking with students. And so there was this interaction between the profession and the student, because the student, and there's so much more connection with the profession in things like that, in things like medical school, which we're always trying to compare ourselves with. We're professionals just like they are, right? Yet we always seem to, have this disconnect between we school in a bubble, we practice in a bubble. I sought out working in a firm. And like I said, when I came back, it was almost like I did myself a disservice, because the professors were telling me, oh, you're thinking too practically. It doesn't have to be buildable. Like, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, it does. I mean,
no, not in school. It doesn't.
I would, so I took time off between my 3rd and 4th year. And so when I went back and I was in 4th year, I was doing, and you would expect, and I don't know what anybody's expectations about what you should know in 4th and 5th year, but it should be getting close to being able to be somebody who's competent enough to understand their design and how to start putting things together, at least start critically thinking about how things go together, right? Maybe, I don't know.
Maybe, but yeah, somewhat. Sure.
But when they said that, the objective is that, it's just like, we're not really here to teach you how things go together. We're here to teach you how to think about how things go together. I'm like, what does that mean?
I just had a conversation with Christine Williamson, Building Science Fight Club, the Instagram account on my other podcast. We can't talk about the other podcast here, right?
We can't. And
well,
I'm enamored with her Instagram account. I mean, even at like my advanced years of profession, I learn a lot from her. She's amazing.
Yeah. So she's been running this Instagram account, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but she talks a lot about envelope, right? And it's a lot about moisture protection, things like that.
Yeah.
Like these are advanced industry terms. But I mean, this is where risk is involved in being an architect. And so she concentrates on building science and really about the things that keep you from taking on too much risk by understanding a framework of how things go together. So it's not just like, this is a detail and this is why it's drawn like this. It's like, this is what it's doing. This is how these pieces go together, and they're doing the thing that you need them to do so that you're not going to get sued, for instance, but also just so that you're smarter when it comes to that next project that you're going to be designing. And I think one of the things that school is good at, and not necessarily in that way, is giving you a framework, right? Like you talked about learning how to think. It's a framework of how to think. It's a framework of how to design. It's a framework for how to synthesize something from nothing into something. Right. And that's the whole idea of what design is. And that's why architecture and architects are so valuable, is because we can work with potential. Like it's not there. It does not exist. We can take this thing that is just people's ideas and constraints and needs and all these things and turn it into reality by assembling all these parts in just the right way to make it happen. And I mean, don't forget, every building we put out there is a prototype. Like it's not even, for the most part, I mean, we're getting to the point where there's industrialized construction and there's prefabrication and things like that, where it is the same thing kind of reproduced in a much more manageable way. And most of the industry is not there as far as like capital A architecture goes, that's for sure. So it's just about frameworks. And so there are some schools, I would assume, that are very good at giving you environmental controls frameworks, at giving you materials frameworks, like when you talk about building materials. And we all had those courses, even though they were very limited. There are some that focus more on that stuff than others. I think that the thing that's being pointed out in this article is like, do we really need so much of design framework?
Right.
And still, can we turn out, and my comment, I guess, on this whole article is, yeah, maybe we don't need to focus so much on design. And I wish that the education system, maybe they think they're like this. I kind of don't get that sense with most of the graduates that come out, is that they're not playing the long game of creating great architects.
Mhm.
They're processing people through a business, and the business is this architectural education.
Yeah.
And that business needs to be attractive to get students to come in, to pay the tuition fees, to get the degrees, and then to have success stories as they launch into their career, because then the school can talk about those metrics. And that's important for someone who's looking at a school to go to say, like, will I be able to do something with this? And so the nuance of this is not unlike the nuance of what it's like to be an architect. Like, what we do is really hard. It's really hard. Like, again, it's a miracle that this stuff actually gets built. And there's people who do this every day, and they're awesome at it. But there's so much nuance in the education system as well that I don't think is being considered in an article. Again, there's like just not enough depth in this article for me to like actually say, here's how we're going to fix it. I don't think that there's not enough there for me. There's not enough meat. And like, how do you fix it? Man, I don't know. But there are some great minds in this profession who could get together and start to actually solve that problem, and then do it at a school, and then prototype it there, and then again share and get this stuff out there to raise all boats inside of our profession to get people to be closer to becoming really good architects over time.
It's interesting. So I had mentioned that it would be nice to kind of have a little bit more involvement with the profession in school. You know, as you were talking about that, I started to think about, I've had practitioners come in and be visiting professors. You'd almost expect that a practitioner would come in and sort of bring a little bit of practice of like what you're actually going to expect in your future, in the rest of your life, into some of the studios that they do. But it's interesting is that not very many of them did. And it's kind of interesting. So like, go back to there's a lot of great minds out there. Yeah, there are. And I would love for the great minds of academia and the great minds of the profession to kind of get together and talk about what is
across the streams.
You know, exactly. How can we defeat Gozer? In turn, though, those the practitioners need to know that, hey, you're not going back just to kind of like do a little more of the same. It's no, we need to start thinking about it different. So when I was reading this article, I was thinking about a jury that I had attended years ago. It was a 5th year studio. These were kids who were about to graduate. And I'm looking at some of their floor plans, and they're going through and they're talking about all of the different rationale behind the design itself. And I'm like, but where are your doors? And they're like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, you're showing me a floor plan on your ground floor. And you're talking about this intervention into the landscape and all of this other stuff. But where are your doors? You don't have any doors. It's just like, oh, well, once it's built, you know, and you start to see the traffic flow around it and stuff like that, that's when, you know, you would know where they would go in. And you're just like,
so there was no concept.
I was like, it's not exactly how it works. And
yeah, not at all.
And that was a 5th year studio that was being taught by a practicing architect who has a successful career that I actually admire. And they were,
but you can't teach them all. I mean, I've taught. I know what this is like, and this sucks to say, but man, there are students that those professors give up on completely, and they're still going to graduate.
So now fast forward to Monday, a few days ago, I was in my ACE class, and one of the students, as we're sitting there, we're talking, you know, and I was like looking at the PowerPoint that they're pulling together. That's ultimately going to be part of their final presentation. And I'm like, well, where'd you get all of these great pictures of the existing building? She's like, oh, I went out and took pictures. She goes, how can you design anything without really actually seeing and understanding the site? It's like, oh my God, welcome to the profession. Yes, please.
Come under my wing.
Exactly. You know, come on in. The door is open for you. And if you keep thinking like that.
There's that spectrum.
Yes.
There is that spectrum too, right? It's like, where are your doors?
She's a 10th grader in high school.
Yeah, right.
there's a junior in high school who is doing a lot of the Revit work for this project team, because they're broken up into teams. And there's this kid, he was like placing all of the doors. He was like nudging them over. And I'm like, well, why are you putting them off of adjacent wall, the perpendicular?
You're testing him.
No, I was just asking him why he was putting doors, where he was putting them. He goes, well, that's where I normally see them. I'm like, well, you're not wrong. And here's why we normally do things like that. And, try to explain to him the things, and so now I've been doing ACE and again, for people who don't know what ACE is. ACE is a way to introduce high school students into the potential future careers that are available in architecture, design, construction, engineering, and all that stuff. And so I've been doing it now for 8 years, and I've evolved in the way that I teach to try to talk to them about the why we do what we do. A lot more than just, here's something, remember it. It's just like, here's something, remember it, but here's why you actually do it. Because if you don't understand the why, there's really no point in understanding what it is. And I'm just sitting there, we were talking about, yesterday, the structural engineer was, she's kind of walking around talking to all of the different groups and stuff. And she came by and she was kind of quizzing the kids, because these kids actually get actual credit for these. They can, they're getting high school credit, actually getting college credit for these. And so they want to kind of like know that people are learning something. And so the structural engineer is going to come in and ask, structural engineer type questions. And so she starts asking about, tell me about all of the different forces. All of the kids actually answered all the different forces. But then as the structural engineer walked away, she just wanted to know, and this isn't a knock or anything. She was just asking, this was information that was put out. Were you guys paying attention? And that's what she was checking on. But what I wanted to check on is like, did we really go through what those forces are and what they really mean? I mean, I understand that you're
memorize the forces.
It's just like, I understand that you're just high school, and it doesn't really matter to you if you know what they are. They aren't, because if you're really just trying to get credit for this, just memorize what they are, and they are. However, if you guys are really interested in going into the profession, you're going to need to know what those forces really are, what they do, how they affect your design, how they affect your building, how they affect the material choices, how they could potentially affect the budget. Yeah. And I started like walking through and talking about it, and they all just sat there. They stopped what they were doing and they were listening and stuff. And I was like, does this make any sense to you? Like, yeah, it's really interesting. And I'm like, I actually remember having these conversations in college with my professors. And I had to figure out the why throughout my career, not in school. And so maybe the conversation isn't necessarily about how do we make people understand how to put together a building and detail it out and do the wall, proper wall sections and proper plan and section details and all that other stuff. But they need to understand the why we do those things, and the why that if you want this design, you're going to need to understand how you can achieve that design. And that's what we're missing right now, is we're missing the how you can practically achieve that design with the understanding of the materials and the everything else and how you put it together and all that other stuff out there. You don't really have to like 100% understand that, oh yeah, by the way, because this is an egress stair, you need to have a fire rated wall and a fire rated door and all this other crap. You don't really need to do that, but you need to understand the whys.
So is the answer less design in school to get to there? Or is it, I mean, we hear this all the time, right? The answer is to do more. All the people involved need to do more. Right. The students need to dig in deeper. They need to go farther. They need to have that internal motivation to really kind of suss these things out so that they have the frameworks to at least ask the right questions when it's appropriate. And then there's the professors who need to put in a lot more effort into every student and these lectures and all those things. And then there's this whole idea of retention versus being able to look things up. And so I don't know what the answer is, because it's like school should actually probably be twice as long than it is. And student debt's already a problem. So it's like, whoa, there's a huge mess here to do.
So you asked the question, can there be less design? In a way, yes. But it's not less design as in, what was interesting about my fourth year is that, the first semester we did a project. The second semester, we actually built upon that project. First, we started to look at it in a very kind of like narrow context. And then we started to look at it in a bigger, broader context as we started to go further and further. And I'm not opposed to doing things like a year-long project that actually starts to teach you the reality. In fact, if you think about it, the reality of some of our design process is a year. I'm on year 2 of a project. Now, granted, it's 8 buildings instead of 1 building, but on a normal average project, we're going through conceptual design, schematic design, design development, construction, documentation, and permitting, all like within a year, 16 months, something like that. And so it's not too much out of the question to really go through a process, maybe not get to like the construction document phase, but start talking to them about the whys of how do you achieve this design? It's like you're going through all of this concept of how it touches the landscape and all of these other different things. Yesterday, when we were on the charrette, a bunch of mid-career people were on this call, or late career people were on this call, and all of them were talking about broad, big idea concepts and stuff. So we're never too far away from the big ideas and then how to we hone it back down to the actual practical building. And so to have projects like that really start to teach you the process. Okay, you did this. Next step is you would be doing this. The next step is you would be doing this. And it's not stealing from this notion of creativity. It's actually helping reinforce that you can become more creative when you understand why you're doing what the hell it is that you're doing.
Sure. Yeah. The more information you have earlier, and whether that's information that you know or that you can get, helps, right?
Yeah.
To know what those constraints are, because then you know where you can break them. And I think this is off topic, but this whole idea of what's going on with AI in the practice and what we're seeing kind of take off it's interesting to me, because it's like all of that is going off of things that have already been done. Yeah. And so if it's been trained on language models out there, I guess the only reason I'm bringing this up is it doesn't know how to break the rules. Whereas that's what architects do. It's like you figure out how to break the rules. You figure out how to and you're not breaking the rules. You're just coming up with a creative way to get around something or solve it in a particular way. You need a lot of information up front. And I think that's maybe what's so frustrating for everybody, at least on the practice side, when they get a new graduate in. It's like, why don't they know this already? Well, I guess you don't know it till you know it, but also everybody's already got too much to do. And if we just want to cram more in, and that's why I keep coming back to this idea of trade-offs, and is the answer less of this so that we can do more of this other stuff, is like something's going to still suffer in there, because it's like none of it is enough. Like you can't cram it all in the shortest amount of time possible. When did you got your license 17 years after you graduated? I got my license 17 years after I graduated. Right. We both had this idea like, I'm not ready yet. Right. I mean, there of course are people who are like, I'm ready right now. What are you talking about? I didn't feel like I wanted to do that yet. And that's because you're gaining experience. It's a constant learning experience all through your entire career.
Now, if we knew back then, before all of this, that the license isn't this gateway to, okay, now you know everything. It's always going to, you're always going to be learning. You're always going to be experiencing something new. We had a different philosophy behind getting our license, and that's just for us. And I don't begrudge anybody getting their license a lot earlier. In fact, in a way, I looked at it this way, and I'm serious. And if I keep beating a dead horse, I apologize about this, but this whole notion of understanding the why is honestly the most important thing that architects can be. I don't necessarily want them to be able to understand how to put together the building, but if they know the why of this is,
the fundamentals,
this search to be able to put it together, and they can understand that and they can master that, the search, the looking for, then you're going to put it together, and you're going to put it together right. But we've talked about this in the past where people don't know when to ask the right questions, or they don't know to ask questions. They don't know what they don't know.
They don't know the right question to ask.
And then a lot of times they just don't ask it. And And then they bill to general overhead rather than a project because they're just sitting around all day. I didn't know what to do, so I didn't do anything. It's just like, when you are taught to pursue the why you're doing what it is that you're doing, you will always have something to do.
It's true. And that stuff will fall into place
Exactly.
if your pursuit is the why.
Yeah.
And I guess that gets back to this idea of having the right frameworks to start with, which is exactly what Christine and I talked about. And that's her goal with her Instagram channel, is to create better frameworks for people so that they can pursue the why when they're actually doing a project, but have a baseline set of fundamentals as guiding principles, right? And that if you can get those, you can figure the rest out.
And that's what I love about her channel, is because she is teaching you the fundamentals. If I want to keep water out of my building, where are the resources? And so I can look at a set of
it's on Instagram.
Well, yeah, exactly. But I mean, I can,
which is wild.
Exactly. Well,
they're not learning it in school. You're not getting it from a senior project. The mentorship is a total problem in the industry. And it's like, where is it? It's on, I think it's absolutely wild that you can actually find this information on Instagram, which is not what Instagram is for, but she figured out a hack.
Remember when we were on a panel together and somebody had asked you, what was the most valuable research tool, or what was the most valuable tool?
Productivity tool.
Yeah,
productivity.
And what did you say?
Yeah. I said YouTube.
You said YouTube.
Which is where our show is now. It's on YouTube.
See, there you go. I just teed it up.
Look at
exactly. So that's the thing, is understanding that there's resources out there, that you don't have to recreate the wheel, but you just need to know that, hey, I need to keep water out of my building, and there's resources out there that will teach me.
You just got to figure out what you can actually trust.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Discernment. You'll need that discernment.
That's a different conversation altogether. Well, we can fall down that rabbit hole easily.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't think that we've figured this out in the least, but at least we're talking about it. And I think that this is critical. It's great to be critical, and we're going to have some more conversations coming up very soon. It's really good to be critical of our profession. It's really good. And I think one of the things I want to talk about in an upcoming episode is kind of the difference between pessimism and being critical.
Yeah.
Because I think that is, a lot of people see this kind of conversation, the kind of articles that we talked about today, some things we're going to be talking about in the future, as too pessimistic. And like, obviously we're passionate about this industry. And I know that a future guest coming on the show is also really passionate about making the industry, the profession, better.
Right.
And that's why we're so interested in having these conversations. And without these conversations, things will not change, right?
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
All right. Well, should we sign off?
Sure.
Our inaugural live Archispeak podcast channel here on YouTube. And, of course, we're still doing the audio version. But again, everybody head on over to YouTube, hit the link in the show notes, and we'll see you next time.
See you all, and thanks for watching.